Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Ani Dasgupta. I'm the President and CEO of WRI. And it's an absolute pleasure to co-host this event, which with the German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, popularly known as BMZ. We have a partnership with them for a long time. It's a real distinct pleasure to have this at the IMF World Bank Spring Meetings. It's a fantastic moment for us to come together, but also ask questions about development, about what needs to happen next and what are the innovation needed. What we're going to discuss today, and we have a really phenomenal lineup of speakers, is one of the biggest questions that we all face. It's absolutely clear from every evidence in the world, if you look at the last IPCC report, that the world has to decarbonize at actually a rapid pace. At the same time, most of the developing world also has to grow, develop, meet basic needs. The question is, how do we actually decarbonize, but also develop and protect livelihoods at the same time? How do we do the both things? Today's discussion is on this just transition, not just transition to a lower carbon future, but a transition that is just, that is fair to the neediest people of the world, but developing world in general, which has to grow at the same time decarbonize. This is a very significant issue. The question is, we will hear from many voices, what are the instruments out there? What are the things we should be thinking about? What are the innovation that's going on or needs to happen for us to meet this dual challenge in this moment as we see it? The IPCC work and report that you see tells us that we have to peak in 2025, get to 50% reduction of emission by 2030 and be net zero by 2050. All this while happening where 1 billion people in the world still live in a slum-like condition, or a similar number have faced food security. How do we do this together? That's the topic. Thank you for joining us. I just want to take care of some of the basic logistics of this meeting. First of all, this is being recorded and live streamed. International Sign Language that you can just see right now. It will be available throughout. The Q&A feature of this provides the opportunity for all of you to engage. We'll have time in the end to pick from the questions we have to ask the speakers. The structure of the meeting will hear from a couple of opening remarks, wonderful from two different parts, from the minister and an academic. Then we'll get to hear what the bank is planning from one of the best speakers I can imagine for the World Bank on the topic. And then we'll have a panel, and then we'll open it up. So that's the plan. And I'm going to jump right in with welcoming Minister Sven Assulje, whom most of you must know, for the German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation Development, BMZ. She's the new minister there. We worked with her a lot as she was the environment minister before that. And let's welcome her. Let's hear from her through a video message, please.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we are in a phase of transition with overlapping global crises where development progress of the last decades is being undone. Because of extreme weather events, the COVID-19 pandemic and conflicts, for instance, right now, the war against Ukraine, global challenges are the new normal, which the international community needs to address more effectively. The climate crisis is jeopardizing the survival of humankind, and it is affecting the poorest most. To me, the fight against the climate crisis is the central social issue of our time. Climate action is an imperative of social justice, and that is why it is one of the top priorities of the German government. The main driver of the climate crisis is the energy sector. It accounts for 73% of the human-made greenhouse gas emissions. And that is precisely why we need a transition towards clean energy production. It will radically reshape our societies and economies and must enable everyone in the world to live a life of dignity. Transitioning to a green economy can create up to 18 million new jobs worldwide. Two things are particularly important to me when it comes to making the energy transition a success. First, the transformation towards a climate-neutral economy needs to be socially compatible. This process can and must create more and better jobs, particularly in developing countries. Social protection must be improved. The energy transition must leave no one behind. And so Germany is supporting its partner countries in their policy reform efforts and is promoting just energy transition partnerships with countries that are pursuing ambitious climate targets. The German government wants to expand these partnerships under its G7 presidency. And second, up until now, only a fraction of climate financing has gone into policy reforms. So far, this is a missed opportunity. Policy-based financing could support countries in their efforts to improve their macroeconomic environment, for instance, by reducing fossil fuel subsidies and introducing incentive for transitioning to renewable energies. The World Bank is the key actor in all that and should take more action in this regard. Ladies and gentlemen, the global socially just energy transition is an investment in the future and an opportunity to achieve sustainability and resilience. Let us seize it together.
Thank you very much, Minister. Schulze, thank you very much. That was a great way to frame this. We have the luxury now to invite Mariana. Mariana Mazzucato is a professor of economics and innovation of public value at the University College of London, where she's the founding director of the UCL Institute of Innovation for Public Purpose. Mariana, thank you for being here. Mariana, I just want to focus on the word transition that we all use all the time. And the question is not the technical transition of reduced to carbon, but it's a societal transition, a political transition, a social transition that we're talking about. Tell us and our viewers, what are the key challenges we have politically and socially as we think about this transition that we should be very aware of?
Sure. Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. I think the biggest challenge we have really is the mindset. We've somehow gotten stuck thinking that the role of policy is there to patch things up. And, we're going from crisis to crisis to crisis, the financial crisis, the climate crisis, this health pandemic that we're still completely in the middle of. And moving towards a proactive, not a reactive mode, to be more prepared, and also really to kind of shape the markets of the future. Use all the different levers that governments have globally to tilt the playing field by making it more rewarding to actually kind of do the right thing in terms of building inclusive and sustainable economies. I think this really requires a different type of policymaking. And in terms of the climate transition, what this means is that we really need to use the broad spectrum of both kind of supply side investment policies, demand side policies, which are about, for example, using the levers of public procurement in every single country, but also, of course, the wider idea of really designing the policy landscape so it's in fact more, again, rewarding to make long run and not just short term quick investments. We need tax policies, which I'm always shocked, for example, that we continue to tax labor more than materials in many countries. We need, of course, long-term investments, and that doesn't help when we have the current structure of capital gains tax. And of course, fossil fuel-driven investments should be discouraged through the tax system itself. But that requires then not kind of choosing either or. And what we usually have, which is quite interesting in many developed countries, I think we have an overemphasis on areas like carbon pricing, and on developing countries, an overemphasis on the investment side without then actually structuring the policy background so that we really have that coherent and systemic transition. For example, the World Bank recently helped Egypt build the world's largest solar power plant, but at the same time, the country kept subsidizing fossil fuels by 5% of GDP. My own work has really looked at how we would have never had the digital revolution, the nanotech revolution, the clean tech revolution, which is still kind of, taking off globally, had there not actually been a really broad and deep level of public investment, both on the kind of upstream side of, basic research R&D spending. On the demand side, we wouldn't have Moore's law in some ways without the purchase of, all those semiconductor chips, but also the demand side. If we look at in the past with other general purpose technologies that had massive impacts on our economies, for example, the mass production revolution would not have had the effect it did in our economies without policies like suburbanization that acted as a demand pull. And in some ways, the green revolution that we require right now should also be a demand side pull of what is still an unfulfilled IT revolution. We need a lot more green digital services, for example. This is something that Denmark is #1 provider of today of China. Denmark, by having really local policies around making, for example, Copenhagen the greenest city in the world, they ended up helping the startup community become a really dynamic group of small innovating companies that are today, again, the #1 providers of high-tech green digital services to China. So that kind of interaction between strategic public investment, but also coherent tax policy that make it in fact more rewarding to go down a sustainable route of production is absolutely what we need. And I think this is more important now than ever because, of course, with these COVID-19 recovery funds globally, but also now this massive increase in military spending due to the geopolitical crisis we can't waste this crisis. These are terrible, human tragedies we have, but all this money that's being created in this context, it will be wasted if it's not really driven and used to drive a more sustainable growth path. And what's interesting is some countries, like in France, the Minister of Finance made there be conditionalities, for example, for the loans provided during the COVID-19 period to Renault and to Air France. They had to commit to reducing their carbon emissions in the next 5 years, whereas in other countries we've had just a lot of bailouts and handouts. This is a problem because, of course, any government lever could be used for transformation as opposed to just a guarantee or a subsidy. In recent years, I think what Germany has done for its own lending programs around development finance has been quite interesting. When a large kind of sector like the steel sector, which globally is asking for help, came to the KfW, the German public bank, asking for a loan, the bank actually made that loan conditional on the steel sector lowering its material content, which it of course did, not because it went to Davos to talk about purpose and stakeholder value, but because it had to. Had to in order to get the public loan. So this is really, I think, an excellent opportunity to reform kind of the social contract, the public-private partnerships that are at the heart of any sort of development finance, because the contracts are, between the state and business. These need to become more and more drivers of sustainable growth at the heart of how we actually understand the role of policy, not just as, again, subsidies, bailouts, handouts, recovery funds, but as real strategic opportunities to transform our economies in order to build forwards better. So that wonderful sentence, building forwards better, is not just, as Greta Thunberg says, blah, 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 but really becomes a reality within the contracts themselves. And that's why I think, development policy finance is just so crucial. And unfortunately, it continues to be a small share of the total development finance being provided globally. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marianne. I really liked how you framed it. Two things really stood out for me. That your first point, which I couldn't be, proactive policymaking, not reactive policymaking. And the second point you made, that it's a whole economy needs to be shaped. So every instrument of choice, we need to be thinking about how do we shape the incentive structure of the future. The example you use, your KfW, is a very good example of that. And also what happened at the COVID, what France did with the airlines is not what happened in other places with other airlines. The United States, where I lived, that did not.
Yeah, EasyJet in the UK, 600 millions, no condition attached.
Yeah, so there were opportunities, right? That's what the point you're making. There were clear opportunities that other people use. This idea of whole economy shift, please hold on to that idea of all of your joiner. This is exactly what are the instruments that help us to think about the economy Maria, thank you very much for joining us. It's
Thank you so much. And
You've
apologies, I need to leave early.
Not at all, not at all. It's a distinct pleasure for me. I can't tell you how happy I am to ask Indamit to join the stage with me. Indamit is someone I've known for a while. He's one of the actually smartest economists who thinks about this particular topic we're going to talk about. How do you actually think about shifting the whole economy? Before I introduce Indamit, I just want to say in 2022, we actually find ourselves in a different place than we found ourselves in Paris in 2015, 14. Two things have happened. You know, no country is questioning that climate change versus development debate. Actually, the smallest countries in the world have more ambitious climate plans than the largest country. And the second, so it is not, people are not questioning that. And I think there's a complete recognition that climate is not just a bucket somewhere in the economy. We are actually now discussing how do you shift the whole economy that is lower carbon, but also meets human needs, development needs of countries like India that actually has to produce 1 million jobs a year just to keep up with the demographic shift. That is what we're going to talk about. It's absolute pleasure for me that Indamit is here. Indamit currently is the Vice President for Equitable Growth, Finance Institutions of the World Bank. That's a mouthful, Indamit. I'm glad you're doing all those things. But Indamit has been working on this topic for a long time. He's been in the bank, he's a professor at Duke, and really been the cutting edge of thinking about how the economic thinking in the bank about this question of development and climate and the whole economy shift, how that can be worked on. Indamit's going to share with us what is going on in the bank, what are the instruments they're using, and how that can help us answer the question that is in front of us. Indamit, I believe you're going to share some slides with us. Over to Indamit.
Thank you. I don't know if you can see my slides now. Can you?
We actually see all your slides. Maybe you want me to see just one of them.
Okay, I got it. Let me do it like this now. Oops. Does it work? You know, I may have to just keep it at this one.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah. I hope that's okay. No, not that. Hold on a second. I don't know what I did here. Let me go back again. Hold on.
Indamit, this is fine actually. We can see your slide.
Yeah, but I can't see my notes now. All right, hold on a second. Hold on just a second. Okay. All right, this is good, right? So let me start by showing you three don'ts, right? So first, actually, Ani, let me, first I have to thank you for inviting me to speak, and thank you, and and a big thanks to Minister Schulz and my friend Jürgen Sattler, and to all of our distinguished panelists. So actually, Mariana has already made the main points that I wanted to make, and she's made them much better than I'm going to do. So my job is done and I can be completely relaxed, and you can cut me off at any time you like. So I'm going to make these 3 points today, and in the most general manner, there are these sort of 3 don'ts. So the first one is, of course, don't let urgency become the enemy of progress. Remember that this is a marathon, it's not a sprint. The second is don't see pushback from developing countries as a lack of commitment. So actually, if you think about it, you actually find that richer countries are much more climate resilient than poorer countries. And so to the extent that these countries would like to become more climate resilient, they see economic development as an important way to get there, okay? And one has to sort of keep that in mind. And so the way that I sort of see it is the twin goals that we have at the World Bank, which is poverty reduction and shared prosperity, actually together they equal climate resilience, plus some specific action, then we can talk about that now. And then the third one, of course, is don't let visibility or sort of high profile things become the enemy of true effectiveness. You have to sort of see, you have to see visible investments versus invisible policies, and you have to sort of see both of them as important. So these economy-wide reforms plus sector-specific investments, they equal climate action and development success, right? So let me show you a few slides. The first one is it's worthwhile to sort of step back a little bit, just as Mariana did, that we are here because of a notable global shift regarding how policymakers ought to be, how they ought to be tackling climate change. So you said that, that we are all actually very committed to this, and that's absolutely correct. But it wasn't too long ago that we were all taking a very piecemeal approach to diffusing what everybody agreed was an existential threat, right? And when you actually put it this way, it seems odd, and it was, because if you have an existentialist threat, you shouldn't be taking a piecemeal approach to it, right? But despite specific or not so specific commitments by virtually all economies, actions in support of them were largely project by project or sector by sector. So it's sort of like taking a watering can instead of a mechanized sprinkler to water a big lawn. It involves too much sweat and too much water, right? Now this is less and less the problem now. So all governments actually recognize the need for comprehensive climate action, and many are putting in place what we call whole of economy programs to address climate change. And we've made a similar shift at the World Bank. We have been making this shift for years, actually more than a decade. But our climate change action plan, which was announced by President Malpass last year, it reiterates what we've always known is necessary. It's the greening of entire economies while focusing on a just transition, right? And the substantial contribution from the government of Germany to help us do this is funding the very core of the action plan. And this support is bringing a lot of heft to our efforts, and it has already given us a lot of heart, okay? Now, we have to be clear-eyed, though, about the task ahead, because climate change will be a decades-long endeavor. It reflects, because it reflects a planet-scale market failure, which has played out over 150 years, it requires structural reforms, as all market failures do. They always require structural reforms. And remember that structural reforms take time, and they come with high short-term costs often, right? They typically take between 5 and 10 years to start bearing fruit. And these reforms are particularly important when it comes to issues of just transition, as many fossil fuel intensive activities are concentrated in specific locations and so on. And you have to remember that even today, I think about half of the electricity needs of developing countries still come from coal, okay, close to half of it. So, and if we need to get out of coal, we have to sort of make this huge shift, right? And it's going to take time. But more importantly, I think for now, it's also involved a comprehensive approach. So you have to keep these efforts steady, but you also have to sort of keep these efforts very broad, and they should actually touch all parts of the economy. Now, so as we saw in the case of COVID, and we saw in the case, as we are seeing now in the case of the conflict in Ukraine, near-term contingencies inevitably divert attention from these longer-term needs. 2 years ago, for example, there was a great opportunity for countries to remove fossil fuel subsidies because oil had become very cheap. But then COVID-19 arrived, and that opportunity was allowed to slip away. We shouldn't let those kind of things happen again, at least not in the same kind of scale that it happened the last time. And I think that what really does help then is to have a comprehensive policy framework that would make sure that one doesn't miss these big opportunities, that one doesn't have to backtrack because you go too fast, and you do things in ways that cannot be sustained for long periods. Now, the second thing also is that a comprehensive policy framework will actually encourage a balanced discussion about the best way to resolve these trade-offs, right? So actually, we think that most governments actually do have the ability to reduce emissions and generate robust growth in the long term. But because we know that economics is the science of scarcity, each country will have a distinct set of trade-offs. And that comprehensive approach helps you identify which things you do now, which things you do later, which things you spend a lot of time on and money on, and which things you spend less, right? So our whole of economy program aims to help poorer countries achieve the right calibration on a permanent basis, okay? Now, the problem is that we are actually starting from a pretty weak position. If you look at this chart, for example, you see the share of policy-based lending as opposed to other actions being specific investments and so on. We are seeing an increase in the amount that MDBs are doing in terms of mitigation, right? But as you can sort of see, all of this increase is not policy-based. It's been mostly non-policy-based stuff. So in fact, if you look at the share of MDB development finance that goes to policy-based lending of the kind that Mariana emphasized, you actually see that it's actually stuck at around 4%, okay, 5%, 4%. That's that jagged line that you see, and you have to look at the right side axis over there, right? So that's a percentage that is policy-based. Now, we've been trying to make shifts in the bank on this one. And if you look at this chart over here, it shows what share of mitigation and adaptation related prior actions in World Bank policy lending are for climate action, right? And if you look at my vice presidency over here, which is the dark blue, the line called FE, you see that we have actually increased over the last 8 years or so. We've increased it from less than 3% to more than 25%. So a quarter of our operations now have climate-related prior actions involved, right? We think it should be even higher because we think that actually because there's very few things that countries ought to do that would not help to move their trajectories to a greener and more inclusive path. We think that these things could be higher. However, I still have to take you back to the previous chart. If you look at the actual financing of this, it's still a drop in the bucket as compared to the overall amount that MDBs are spending on this one. And it looks more like an afterthought over here when it should actually be the foundational part of what we do. So let me end with, just as I ended with 3 don'ts, let me end with 3 do's. The first is that we have to see this as a task that will take decades, okay? This has to be a long-term partnership, so we should be ready for that, right? The second is we have to see development as necessary for climate action. And because climate resilience is the priority for much of the developing world in the next few decades, you have to keep in mind that when you look at countries that are richer, they are far more climate resilient than countries that are poorer. Within these countries, if you look at the poor people almost by definition are not resilient to these shocks, climate or any other. So we have to reduce poverty, right? So I think that that's going to be the priority for much of the developing world for the next few decades. Now, this does not mean that we shouldn't be working on mitigation as well. And in fact, we think that these economy-wide reforms can actually do both these things, that they can be foundational for climate action. And the things that we do at the bank, especially the development policy reforms that we do, that we support through something called DPLs. And, these are a proven instrument for these kind of reforms, and I think we should use them. So let me stop here and back to you.
Indamit, thank you so much. Indamit, can I just ask you, before we move on to the panel, 2 very quick questions to help our audience understand what the 2 very important points you made. One is this idea of, economy-wide shifts, the reform that is required, and that each country will need to make difficult, choices towards this shift, right? There's no one solution. We have to understand the context where the economy is. And in that context, I very much like what you said. MDB, let's talk about World Bank specifically. It's the largest MDB. Just reflect with us the value among all the instruments there are in the world, the efficacy of the DPLs of the world, or any kind of policy-based instrument that the bank has to help countries move towards that. I mean, do you see that it seems to me, where I sit, that is one of the most, among efficacy of instruments, that's a very strong instrument to shift economy-wise policy. Do you see a world where development banks, given that we need a lot of private financing also, focuses on this economy-wide policy shift, and bank does much more? That curve that you showed is actually much more vertical going forward. Just help us think about instrument choices here a little bit, and then we move on to the panel.
Yeah. So Ani, I know that you know this already, but I think it's worth emphasizing that when you do, when we do an operation at the World Bank, we tend to actually base it a lot on work that we've done on the analytical side, right? And development policy lending is especially intensive in that. It's intensive in two ways, right? It's intensive in really getting to the nub of what are the binding constraints to progress in a particular sector, in a particular area, in a particular factor market like land, labor, carbon, etc., right? That's the first part. But the second part, Ani, it's also very important that this work is not done in isolation. It's done jointly with it is done jointly with the counterpart agencies in the government, so that they completely understand, they fully buy into this, and they know how best to actually make sure that you get political support for these reforms, right? And that's one of the things about the DPLs. What they end up doing is, we call them prior actions. For those of you who don't know, is that once a government actually implements those prior actions, and this is a science, I don't think it's a science, it's an art of the possible, essentially, right? You take all of the actions that are necessary, and you take all of the actions that are possible, and you look at the intersection of those, right? And we agree on that one. And they tend, so the really good DPLs tend to be owned by the government. They tend to be based on really rigorous work, and they tend to be programmatic one way or the other. Again, because it reflects the nature of these reforms and so on. Now, this is something that we do, and my part of the bank actually does 80% of these, right? So that's one of the reasons why we are really thankful to the German government for actually giving us this additional amount of support to make sure that the work on climate action is done not just at the project level. I mean, we are very good at that, by the way, right? I think, but also at that we actually put those country strategies in a broader context, and we actually make sure that they're reflected not just in sector-specific investment, but also economy-wide reforms.
Thank you very much, Indamit. Indamit, thank you, and I hope you stay for the discussion. So we're going to move into a fantastic panel to discuss this, what you heard from Indamit, what you heard from Minister, what you heard from Mariana. Let me just bring our first panelist. I'll introduce each panelist as we go. Our first panelist is Alexia Leto-II, who is the Assistant Secretary for International Trade and Development in U.S. Department of Treasury. But Alexia is actually very familiar with the development MDBs, the development bank. She used to actually work at the World Bank for a while. So this is a very familiar territory for Alexia. Alexia, what I want to actually continue the conversation we were just having with Indamit. From your experience and where you sit in the Treasury, help us think about how the development policy instrument can become, or what is its value of becoming the instrument of choice as we think about shifting economies towards this transition.
Thank you so much, Annie, and thank you also to Jürgen for this invitation. I've really enjoyed the conversation so far. And could I just say that, the comment around the whole of economy approach, I think, is matched in the U.S. Government by a whole of government approach to be responsive to the work that's needed. And I've been delighted at Treasury to see that we are really working with all parts of our government to be good partners on this issue. So, instrument of choice, I'm not sure that's the phrasing I would use. Let me say the following. I think it's so important that we're having this discussion because there's often such a focus on the financing bit, right? The 100 billion, et cetera, that the concept of how important getting the right policies in place has not received due attention. So that's the first thing I want to say. Before we get to the instrument itself, is I just want to fundamentally agree that getting the right policies in place is such a big part of the equation. Having countries themselves articulate a vision for where they want their economies to go, for that vision to then manifest itself in their NDCs, in their long-term emissions planning, that really is, you know, at the heart of what we're trying to do. And then the question is, how can development partners support the countries to deliver on that vision? And there, I think the DPLs are indeed a very powerful instrument for a number of reasons. And I want to sort of outline 5, you know, quick reasons. I think the first one is just very much that it recognizes that policy is at the center of change, right? And so with a good DPL, you really are focusing on the policy and regulatory changes, and Mariana covered many of them that are needed. Secondly, I think in the context of a DPL, you can also really think through what financing tools are also needed at the country level to really unlock the private sector that will come in if the policy space is created in the right way. And so this is about financing tools that can help allocate risks in more rational ways, in ways where the public sector is taking the right amount of risk to allow the private sector to come in, for example. Thirdly, I would say that in the context of good DPLs, and I think Indrabit has a lot of experience with this, we really need to have underpinning the DPL really excellent data. Data about what is actually going to be needed to drive the climate changes that we want to see, to drive the kind of climate resilient infrastructure, for example, that we want to see. And that data is also going to be really critical if we're trying to get, again, the private sector to come in, to get the institutional investors to come in as well. Fourthly, I think that the piece around really helping countries to take, for the risk to be reduced at the very early stages through strong project preparation is something that we always say, but because we've always said it does not mean we've solved it. That remains really, really important. And then the final point I will make is something that the minister really underscored, which is I think DPLs and concessional financing specifically is really critical in terms of making sure the transition is just and that impacted communities are really supported and their vulnerabilities are sort of minimized in the first instance, but then with more ambition, that there is actually a pathway for them to be able to sort of benefit from better, greener jobs, right? And so that piece is also really critical.
Thank you so much, Alexia. I would want to really come back. I like the point you made. The goal here is to have the right policies in place, and after that to get the right choice of instrument, but also to figure out how not only the MDB finance, how private sector finance can flow at the scale it needs to flow. Because no matter if you add up all the bilateral, multilateral finance there is, it doesn't actually match up to the gap there is for greenness. So I'll come back to you on this, what choice of instrument and how we get private sector flow. I really liked that you ended with this idea of just part of the transition. So not only this is morally right, as Indrabit pointed out, there is actually abject poverty and moving. Also for politically more ambitious climate policy, it has to benefit people so that we actually have a system that people actually elect people who would have more ambitious climate policy. Because even today, we actually, among the countries, we have the most ambitious we've ever been. It still doesn't add up to where we need to be among all the countries we add up to 1 point. So more ambition is needed. The question is, how do we actually politically get there. I really want to focus our attention to this just part of the transition. Danielle, I would like to bring you in on the stage, or the virtual stage. Daniel Menele is the head of the President's Climate Finance Task Team of South Africa. As you know, South Africa has just agreed to a very transformational agreement to just transition of the energy sector with money, multiple donors and funders. It's really path-breaking. Every one of us is looking into how that will happen actually. Can that be a kind of a model for us to follow? Every country that I talk to, which is not South Africa, is asking us, what are they doing? What can we learn from them? So Daniel, I'm going to ask you the central question, focused on this fantastic, tell our audience a little bit about the kind of agreement you've come to on the energy transition, but we would really appreciate if you focus on the justice dimension of that, which is a prominent part of the agreement that South Africa. Daniel, over to you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking Minister Schultz and the BMZ for facilitating and inviting us, bringing us all together in this dialogue as key stakeholders and role players to share and exchange views as we can you hear me? There seems to be some interference. All right. So thank you very much for bringing us together. And as we discuss these issues that are arguably form part of the biggest challenges of our times. And of course, in the absence of finance in the right quantity and of the right quality underpinning these transitions, this will all just be talk. So it's quite important that we focus on that. You were asking about South Africa in terms of our partnership and in particular the just kind of nature of it. And I think the first thing I would want to point out is that the JET partnership, the Just Energy Transition Partnership, actually follows principles already established in the 2015 Paris Agreement that referred to just a transition. So as sort of the first of its kind, the JETP represents the first tangible financing partnership that seeks to actively place the just transition at the center of climate responses. And from the onset, when we conceptualized this partnership at COP26, the partners recognized that South Africa, as an economy that is highly dependent on fossil fuel energy sources, was seeking to ensure that justice is an integral part of its climate response, because accelerating the energy transition will exact a high social cost to affected employees, workers and communities. And that also found expression in the political declaration that accompanied the announcement. So, as per the political declaration, 3 sectors are defined as the primary investment focus areas, being energy, the green hydrogen, and electric vehicles. So the justice dimension would be, in the first instance, considered through the lens of how these sectors, as part of the transition, can contribute to protecting, and not only protecting, but also improving the livelihoods of those affected workers and communities. And they were chosen because these sectors represented those that were deemed to be best placed to meet South Africa's targeted NDC range. And within the JETP, just to come directly to your question, I would see a number of the justice dimensions and at different levels. And I think starting with, in terms of meeting the needs of the transition, I think the cost of the transition would contain both creative as well as disruptive elements, which the disruptive aspects of it, as we all know, relates to the accelerated decommissioning of coal power stations, the impact of decommissioning on affected communities and workers through job losses, and the early wind down of coal and related fossil fuel activities, and the disruptive effects of the loss of infrastructure support. around mining towns, which in South Africa are really sort of built around South Africa's coal supply basis. And of course, there's on the other hand, the creative dimensions that relate to accelerating the rate of new investments in essential sectors that would create new jobs, that would lead to upskilling and new livelihood, and ancillary activities that would support such sectors as they emerge. Of course, there will be sequencing issues in this, which means that lags will exist between the creative and disruptive periods. And so it is then critical that building social resilience while orchestrating the rate of new investment versus decommissioning is then critically attended to. There will also be a justice dimension at the level of investment and the use of proceeds. And as per the Paris agreements, that would relate to the loss of jobs and livelihoods, as I've just talked about. But for example, the proximity and impact on workers and coal mines and power station is the subject of a portfolio that is currently under development by Eskom's Just Energy Transition Program. And the investment plan that is currently under construction will need to incorporate how these programs and sectors will contribute to justice in a substantive manner, both in the short term, but of course also for future generations. And I guess the details, the financing package that we are trying to put together will also carry elements of justice, in that developed countries, and it's just been spoken about earlier, have a historical commitment to support this climate response of developing countries. And so that suggests then that the granularity of such packages will need to take account of the transition cost burden to a country like South Africa and the new investment needs and the climate risks that the country faces, and the fiscal impact of such packages from both an affordability but also sustainability perspectives. And then I guess finally, there's also how these funds are made available at the point of greatest impact and need would also exhibit justice dimensions, and they would materialize at that level too. So we have development finance and private banking institutions that are robust, that are very well regulated, and these channels of finance partners in the transition process will complement the international climate finance flows that we're talking about, and we see great potential for them to benefit from the Just Energy Transition Partnership and embed justice in how investment decisions linked to the transition are made. And so in that respect, the DPF could indeed be a very suitable instrument because it supports reforms through non-earmarked general budget financing, which quintessentially allows for more flexibility and supports country ownership and country leadership of programs. And many of you will know that South Africa received a DPF loan of $750 million just in January this year. Let me leave it at that for now.
Annie, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I was rightly muted when Daniel was speaking. Can you hear me now? Daniel, I want to come back to you if I get time. On even now, I know it's early in the process, but it's so unique what's happening in South Africa, things that you're learning that you might want to share with our audience, with others. I'll come back to you, think about it for a minute. I want to bring our third and last panelist, Valerie Laxton. Valerie used to work at IFC before, now she works at WRI. She specifically looks at multilateral development banks and how this works. So Valerie, I'm going to bring us back to actually in the MIT's presentation on policy-based lending, and share with us not just that, but the opportunities and what can happen and what doesn't happen in the decarbonization of the economy that we're talking about. How should we be seeing this particular instrument? Valerie, over to you, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Annie. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Great. So in the past few years, the World Resources Institute has worked in a research consortium together with New Climate Institute and Germanwatch to support without inputs the Paris alignment of multilateral development banks. And this year, we researched DPFs or PBFs and its potential for reaching the Paris goals. And this focus on PBFs, which are provided by the World Bank, but also other development banks, is important because these financing operations, as was said, are about policy, and they may entail policy reforms that can be wide-ranging. They can also be complemented with individual projects or other assistance, but it's this economy-wide or sector-wide approaches, because they can focus on specific sectors, that are needed to support a coherent route to the just transition. And we focused on the potential environment effects of prior actions that Indimit was talking about earlier to understand where some additional opportunities might lie. And I'll talk about that. So you asked me what kind of policy reforms and opportunities could lie there. Well, we already when the Paris Agreement came about in 2015, and together with the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, the direction of travel was very clear. And it would take transforming entire economies and sectors in a way that caters for the needs of diverse communities, diverse people, and diverse countries, especially those whose access to food and energy is limited. And so these transitions concern many, if not all, sectors, going from energy to renewable energies, agriculture to housing, in all countries, regions, rich or poor, and even communities within countries where inequalities keep rising and where the poorest communities are particularly impacted by climate change. So this is a collective action problem, and it does require a collective and comprehensive plan, which we have on paper, in the Paris Agreement and in aligning financial flows to its goals. But implementation is not happening fast, and it takes mainstreaming climate-related and just transition considerations to start implementing these transformations now. And in doing so, identify and start with the poorest and most vulnerable to climate change who are facing existential threats. So when formulating DPFs that are supportive of a just transition, a key element is that these policy-based operations build on existing dialogues, on ongoing dialogues between a bank and the country, the partner country, their counterparts. So engagement in country is crucial to making policy-based finance work. This includes engaging and consulting at all levels with different stakeholders within the country and throughout the stages of preparing a policy-based finance. This could help spot opportunities early on, including planning with different line ministries and formulating policy actions and sequencing the reforms in a way to make them appropriate to the country context and tailored to it, to take into account how prepared the sectors are to transition. And that might require additional technical assistance or identifying additional sources of financing, like the ones we already mentioned. But policy-based financing is a balancing act, and especially at times like the current ones, where there's increasing pressure on public budgets everywhere after the pandemic or in the course of the ongoing pandemic, and where debt dynamics are unfavorable in many countries. Nevertheless, better invest in transition and reforms now, because delaying these reforms only makes them costlier down the roads. So, and also if you invest now in adaptation, the returns are likely higher down the road. So if designed with these elements in mind, DPFs have the potential to support transformations that will actually be sustained. And they often, because they often require reforms that provide broader frameworks and incentives for the economy as a whole, they're flexible and fast dispersing, which explains actually their increased use during times of crises. So as the IPCC made clear and highlighted very recently, there are very few years left to act, and policy actions taken now are the ones that will make a difference down the road. So let's make full use of these prior actions and make them an instrument to address these transitions. And some examples of opportunities in public finance management, for instance, which is an area which features prominently in a large number of PBFs, because it's an overarching way to support budgets and domestic policies and institutions to incentivize development, climate and just transition goals by, for example, reforming taxes and subsidy systems that was mentioned by Mariana, or introducing redistributive mechanisms to support certain groups or communities, or more importantly, to expand the country's capabilities wherever possible. So for this, making sure that there's enough fiscal capacity and room is of the essence, and adverse external economic shocks or cyclical conditions might be a limitation here to invest in adaptation and resilience, or increase investments in low emission developments in sectors such as energy or agriculture. And when it comes to policies that reduce reliance on emissions intensive sectors, these might require exploring opportunities to support the most energy efficient techniques that are available out there, or the most affordable in the local context, or to diversify and rethink agricultural practices to ensure food security for communities. So these two sectors, energy and agricultural and food sector, are fundamental, and also are where socioeconomic considerations and social protection considerations are going to be key to a successful transition. And it definitely requires careful calibration of PBFs in a way to get this balance right. Over to you, Annie.
No, thank you very much, Valerie, of that, and you actually deep dive on the PBF. I wanted to come back. It seems like all of you have spoken, agreed to the whole economy transition part. No one, that's been it started with that, and the question, the role of policy, that it's critical to get it right. You've all talked about how important to modulate that, how important it is to get it is country specific. You just heard from Danielle. I really wanted to go back to Alexa, if I can bring you back. Is the question is, one is we have to get the policy right. We have to get the financing in place at scale, right? It's not just one or the other. The question is, as Alexa pointed out, what role can policy play to get the financing right at scale? So Alexa, this is my question to you, because you mentioned very correctly the role of private capital here, which is, as far as I can see, is not flowing at the rate we want it to flow in the issues we're talking about. So what could, and I ask you because you sit in US Treasury and you are an important shareholder, all the major MDBs, what would, from US Treasury's point of view, like to see these MDBs do in the policy space so that the private capital can flow? What is the space you see? What should happen as we go forward?
Thank you for that. And can I just say to Daniele, obviously South Africa is very much on our mind, particularly with the flooding in Durban. And I think it's one more reason and a reminder as to why this conversation is so important. So just wanted to say that. So the MDBs have a really critical role. And it's a role that's not just about their financing. I want to be very clear about that. I hope you agree, Intermit, because I think the scale of what we actually need to be able to partner with countries to achieve the ambition that I think we collectively have, I don't think the MDBs will be able to meet on their own, which again goes back to the message of why the focus on policy is so important. And so, you know, one of the roles of the MDBs is to really partner with countries to make sure that we have a policy environment and a regulatory environment that will be attractive to the private sector to come in. And for that, a couple of things are needed. I think, first of all, there needs to be a really clear understanding of the criteria of what a climate-aligned program looks like. What is that? And I think some of us who are in the details technically sort of intuitively know, but the reality is that's not good enough. We need to be able to have clear platforms for potential investments where there is certainty that the criteria are met, there's certainty that this is not about greenwashing, there's certainty about the outcomes that we're driving towards with respect to climate emissions, with respect to resilience, with respect to the social inclusion piece, where that is actually clearly defined. And there's a real sense of comfort that the money that will drive these outcomes that we're looking for. So I think that's a really critical place for the MDBs. And of course, the point I made earlier on data is critical here to underpin all of that. I do think also that there is a need for the MDBs to help think through what the range of innovative financial tools are that will, in the most efficient possible way, allow a smarter allocation of risks so that public financing plays its role where it's most needed, especially upfront at the riskiest stage, so that there's the comfort and the demonstration to the private sector that they can indeed come in. So that is critical. But I think the role of the MDBs is also a quote unquote softer role, which is not just around financing, but it's sort of that convening role, that deep engagement, I think, that we've all been talking about with the partners to really help identify the vision and to communicate that also to the private sector, so that there's a real sense of comfort that there is a long-term drive towards the kinds of results that we want to see, and that will be something that's not volatile with a change in government. And you can't promise that, but there is that sort of sense of the long-term horizon, the marathon that Indermit was talking about, and making sure that that long-term horizon, that predictability of what we're driving towards will be there, because obviously the private sector really likes predictability as well. So these are the kinds of roles that the MDBs, I think, need to play, and that does require the MDBs having greater scale than they have today, while at the same time recognizing that part of their role has nothing to do with their own financing, but bringing in private finance. So I think getting that balance right is important. And just on the scale point, I do think that MDBs, and they're doing some of this work already, and I think we need to encourage them, those of us who are shareholders of the MDBs, to do it more, is to really look at their balance sheets and to see whether they can make more effective use and more efficient use of their balance sheets, so that we can get to a greater scale of support from these institutions. And I'm really pleased that the G20 will be coming out with a review of the capital adequacy of the MDBs, and I'm hoping that the political support for the MDBs will be there to allow them to take more risk and perhaps use their capital in more efficient ways. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Alexia. Just for audience, just to put in perspective what Alexia was saying on the volume, I don't remember actually in the meeting when you get a chance to talk what the bank's portfolio this year was. But if you add up all multilateral and bilateral funding, it's every year it's about $300-400 billion together. United States being one of the biggest bilateral funders, but that's the scale. But all the science tells us the scale of the transition financing is $1.6-1.8 trillion. Oh, it's art more than a science, as Nimit says. But that is the scale difference here. So what Alexia's point is that $300 billion has to figure out how to make that next $1.5 billion flow. And a lot of people have used the word catalytic, right? That MDBs play catalytic roles. It's not that just their finance, how they get the other part. So Indermit, I want to come back to you on this. So you showed us a very dramatic chart that how small actually the development policy-based lending is in the, I don't think that was a World Bank, that's all of MDB's portfolio, right? So even if you go very fast, this to increase to the whole thing, when we talk, Alexia was asking the question, where you sit in the mid, what are the other instruments? What are all the instruments we could be using to help us shift from MDB perspective? I want to tell you, I want to pepper this with the questions we're getting from audience. This is a completely separate question, but you are very well placed to answer both of them. And the question was, given that developing countries only 25% of global emission, why are we talking about them only to transform? So over to you, Andaman. Be brief,
Okay.
but I want to go back to others.
Yeah, so I think that the question is a very good one because I think that we are talking about countries that I think that we end up talking about countries like India and South Africa and Indonesia and others that are both reasonably large emitters but are also poor, right? Now, in that sense, Ani, so as I'm listening to Alexia, a thought struck me that, you know, we essentially have this sort of an impossible, we have this impossible trinity, right? We want the transition to be quick, we want it to be just, and we want it to be privately financed, largely speaking, because, okay? It's impossible. These three things together are impossible. And the best way to sort of see that is to just imagine the following exercise. Essentially what we're asking South Africa or India or Indonesia and all to do is something they would have probably done 40 years from now, okay? So in a sense, or 30 years from now, depending on the country, or 50 years from now, depending on another, right? So in a sense, what we are saying is, do today what you would have done 40 years from now, right? Now, which usually means, unless you expect the future generations of these countries to be poorer than what they are today, which contradicts the very definition of a developing country, because in a developing country, somebody 40 years from now is going to be richer than. So unless you, so under all reasonable assumptions, essentially a 40-year bringing forward an action by 40 years for these countries should be accompanied with 40-year money, okay? That means that you're going to be lending them money, saying at reasonable terms, long maturities, saying use this money to do the things that, because you can reduce all of these problems down to money essentially, right? The losers and so on of this transition, you can actually compensate them one way or the other through money. But remember, the private sector, no private sector agency that I've talked with is bringing 40-year money to the deal, okay? So maybe they will help countries like, I don't know, I guess a country like Poland or a country thing, which is already on the doorstep of high income or is already at high income, and and there's money to be made for them. But for the kind of countries that we have in mind when we're talking about this, and the question actually had in mind as well, you are talking about an impossible trinity here. Now, how can you make that amount smaller? So I think one of the things is you can't expect these countries to be funding a very long-term project with short-term money, right? So then you sort of say, okay, now let me try to somehow shrink that amount. It shouldn't be trillions. We can't fund the trillions because we don't have that much public money. So then the question is, how do you make that billions? And I think that's where the reforms come in, because in a sense, what you're trying to sort of do is you're trying to improve the efficiency of these economies so that very small changes in the price of carbon lead to really large shifts towards a greener growth path, that basically that they're very sensitive, that these economies become very sensitive to that. Now, a very inefficient economy by nature is not sensitive. It will take a lot of effort. It will take a lot of public money. It'll take a lot of heavy regulations and so on for them to move to this cleaner growth path. So that in a sense is what you have to sort of think about and say, how do I make it so that once I change the price of carbon, even a little bit, right? The capital moves, labor moves to these cleaner activities and so on. So that's what thing. Otherwise, you have to bring 40-year money to a 40-year problem. You can't say, I'm going to do it on the cheap. I'm going to get the private sector to do it. It'll go back to the same kind of things that I remember that you were at the bank at the time when we said there are all of these large investments that will pay off only in the long term, like, and we called it infrastructure. And we said that there will be a lot of private money that will go into this. And it didn't happen. And as a result of it, infrastructure suffered. We will end up making exactly the same mistake. And we will find that private money will not come. And there will not be the kind of climate action that we could have had we just recognized that at the start.
And that's exactly why I think you and others are emphasizing the role of policy here. It's not just money, to getting the framework right so it is attractive. Because you mentioned South Africa, Daniel, I want to go to you. You obviously, South Africa has made a path-breaking partnership, right? You've made commitments to adjust, to shift a very coal-dependent energy system right now. And you have attracted $750 million from the bank. Then there's a question here, which is very actually important. So let's assume for a minute, you're the standard setter here. What other instruments of financing, Indamil pointed out, that you're seeing happen, and I know it's early in the process, happening to support this just transition?
Well, as you say, in terms of the context of our partnership, it is, of course, still early days somewhat, and many details have yet to be worked out. But I would fully concur with the questions and the comments that have just been made around, funding, long-term nature of the funding, the role of policy, how this funding in terms of quantum, in terms of cost effectiveness, and those types of things needs to come together. So, yeah, and the role of MDBs, the role of DFIs in terms of how advantageously they can fund and how they are in a position to play a role that is quite unique in terms of them being able to work with both the private sector and the public sector and provide long-term financing, which they can refinance at reasonable cost. So that's the kind of issues that we need to look at. But in terms of other instruments from the traditional ones, that's work that needs to be done. The key issue, though, that I think many people have said is that even what is clear is that in terms of the amount, the initial amount that our international partners committed to mobilize in the $8.5 billion, it can only be an initial amount and is relative to what is needed, is relatively small. What is going to be critical is that as we develop these frameworks and these facilities for releasing these funds, that we ensure that what eventually gets put on the table in whatever form and combination of instruments will be a catalyst in terms of what was being said for mobilizing even more resources, tapping into the much bigger pools that are sitting in the private sector. But that is work that we are working through with our partners at the moment to think about what would be the ideal combination in terms of instruments and how best they will serve our needs. As I say, as we define sort of the contours of this partnership, we are involved in very dynamic and very sort of active dialogue with our colleagues. The focus will be in the next couple of months in obviously assessing what actually is on offer, the financing package that our partners are able to offer, assessing that relative to what South Africa needs and what the priorities are. And of course, with that also, on the South African side, refining our transition-related financing needs and getting into some more granularity around the investment portfolio and the investment plans that would meet such needs.
Annie, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. 2 years of practice and still didn't learn this. Anyway, Daniel, thank you very much for this. I was just saying that all of us, very much so from WRI, we are looking forward to learning and partnering with you. I had a very good conversation with your President Commission, head of your President Commission on climate change on this topic just recently. It's a very, very positive development. I want to bring this, we have time for just the last round.
Annie, I'm really sorry. Can I have a two-hander very quickly? It's Alexia.
Yes, please.
Sorry, I just want to come back a little bit to something, connecting something that Danielle just said and then what Intermit said earlier. I think the power of what we're learning in the South Africa model of the Just Energy Transition Partnership is the country ownership in the, at the center with their very, very ambitious vision, and then really bringing together quite a complex set of partners that have access to a complex set of financing instruments with, again, the vision and the policy at the center. But I think I heard Intermit say, private sector is not going to do it. And I just want to, I don't know if I misheard you, but I just want to be careful here. I do not think we can delegate this work to the private sector and think they're going to take care of it. So if that's what you're saying, I agree with you. However, I also do not think that we can afford to do it without them. So we need a range of financing. We need the policy at the center, I agree with you. And then we need financing, purely grant, highly concessional, MDB, DFI, private sector, philanthropy. We need different kinds of financing for different bits of the equation to help move and have sort of that whole economy transformation that we're looking for. But I think if we do not have the private sector as part of the equation for some bits of it, I think we also will not get there. So I just wanted I wanted to push back a little bit on that. We can't leave it to them to magically appear. That's never worked. But we also have to keep pushing on how the capital that is available on the private sector side can start to move in the direction of the kinds of societal and environmental and economic outcomes that we want. So we need all of the available sources of finance to back the policy changes.
Alexia, very well said about the volume of financing needed or the specific roles specific institutions have to play for us to get there. Actually, the energy transition we're talking about right now with Danielle is one of the most fundable among the infrastructure that is privately funded historically, if you look at. So getting the policy and framework right is absolutely a question. In the mid, I can, given the time we have, I know you have a 1 hour response to what Alexia said. You have a 1 minute response to that. Because I really want to ask one question that I see that you ask questions asked to both Valerie and Danielle. Please, in the mid.
So I'm going to switch to Duke Professor mode, and I'm going to give Alexia a lesson on something called the Lucas paradox, okay? Why doesn't capital flow from rich to poor countries? I'm going to send this to Alexia afterwards. But essentially, you have a problem here, right? If you should be seeing a huge amount of money flowing from rich to poor countries. And why doesn't it happen? Well, basically the short answer, I think, is that you have an investment climate in these countries which is very weak, right? So I think one of the things is that, and especially when you're talking about money, especially when you're talking about patient money, you have to have an investment climate that is especially good in the sense that it attracts long-term money, right? If you can do that, if you can make that investment climate good in these countries, then you met the first prerequisite of capital flowing into the private capital flowing into those countries, right? So I don't think I'm disagreeing with Alexia. I'm just saying, be careful about what that would take. That has not happened. That has not happened for most of these countries for a long, long time, okay, ever since 1990. And you can look at the conjectures, you can sort of say, what are those things, all right, over here? Essentially, you actually find that you have 2 or 3 problems. One of them is, of course, monopoly power, because we want this money to be flowing into energy utilities and things like that. And those energy utilities are neither well run, nor is that overall environment particularly conducive to new actors. And then the second one, of course, is asymmetric information and political risk, right? But even if you do those things—
In the mid, I'm sorry, I have to interrupt.
I'm going to stop. I'm going to stop.
In the mid, we hear you, but the two things are here that is different, I think, to Alexa's point, that we actually have learned from the 1990s infrastructure expectation. You're absolutely correct. We tried to do all these subsidy, concessions that didn't work. You're absolutely right. We have learned from that. Also, we seem to have a government of South Africa with a President's Commission, which is ready to do some foundational reforms that we didn't have in many of these cases. What I'm saying is, I'm slightly more optimistic that we have a lessons and preconditions that to experiment with here. But you're absolutely right. I don't think private capital will just flow. We have to focus on the policies and the environment there. So both of you are
if
right.
South Africa can pull it off, Ani, if South Africa can
want
pull
South
this off,
Africa to pull it off, so the other countries
if they can pull it
off.
off, then all of us can, because South Africa is working under very difficult conditions, low growth, high inequality, fiscal constraints, and so on. So you're absolutely right. If they do it, I'm not saying that we shouldn't try. I'm saying if you keep your expectations modest, you will not be disappointed. I
think this is a moment for the world requires us to be not modest and optimistic. I think at this point. We need, I just think if you look at the numbers, at the speed with which you're making change, we have to have bets. In South Africa, I think, Daniel, is one of the best bets in front of us. I really need to, I see Jürgen sitting there quietly and patiently. Daniel, you want to say, you have 30 seconds, and then I want to move to you. Daniel, go ahead.
No, it's just a quick footnote to what has been said, and just to support, I guess, both Alexia and Ani, because I think, as we said earlier on, absolutely critical that there is political will that gets demonstrated around preparedness to tweak policies, to align regulations, and those kind of things, and accountability mechanism, that there is a good financial management discipline. So a country like South Africa that's embarking on this ambitious project is very well aware of that. We're very clear that you need to construct very precise investment pathways, that issues of policy direction and policy certainty are really, really important investment prerequisites. But we are seeing a difference though, and we've had good experience, for instance, with the renewable energy program in South Africa, where public-private partnership and crowding in private sector is possible. And I think the whole issue that was indicated earlier around sort of whole economy a transition, if one considers that what we're looking at here, still is energy policy, environmental policy, industrial policy, you name it, and fiscal, of course. It also requires a slightly different way about how we think about, allocating risk, investment time horizons, and those kind of things. And I am actually on the side of those that are slightly more encouraged, because in the conversations that we've been having, admittedly very early in the process, we are starting to see and sense contributions that are starting to emerge that are sort of different from traditional models, and that decision trees may be informed by slightly different considerations going forward. So, but it's absolutely critical. Patient money is shy, and needs to be comfortable.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for the optimism and also the realism in what you just said, and much appreciated. I really want to thank all of the panelists for this very interesting, actually it turned out to be more interesting than I was expecting. So thank you, Alexa, and thank you, Indamit, and thank you, Valerie, for being part of it. I want to welcome Jürgen Sattler. Most of you know him. Jürgen, great to you here. Jürgen is the Director General of the German Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ, but Jürgen actually also used to be the Executive Director of the World Bank for Germany, so he's very, very familiar with this. Jürgen, you have this impossible task of summarizing this discussion and helping us to move forward.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ani, and really it has been a pleasure to listen such a lively debate. I think that's really rare, but also challenging for me because I couldn't intervene, and there were so many pieces and spots in the discussion I would really have liked to. Anyway, I would like to make 4 points, and I hope that it reflects the thrust of the debate. The first one is, and I'll start with Germany and myself. So when I look at my country, and we want to go that way, energy transition and climate transition, then I can say we can't afford just to invest to finance investments. We have to go for policy changes. And for example, our finance minister would not allow to spend more money if the policy framework, for example, to promote coal and at the same time to finance renewable projects doesn't make really sense. So in Germany, we can't afford to do that. And Germany is a rich country. Developing countries are under fiscal stress. And for them, it's even more convincing to say, you know, just to finance renewable projects or other transition projects without adapting the policy and regulatory framework is very costly. And they can't afford that, in particular, not in that time of fiscal stress. So that's the first point I would like to make. We talk about shifting the trillions. I think we do not have the right to use that word if we do not address the question and the challenge of regulatory and policy frameworks. Because when we talk about shifting the trillions, we talk about private money. So how would you expect that private money comes in more forcefully if you do not have a better regulatory, fiscal, macroeconomic framework? As Intermit has said, the frameworks are weak and we can't expect that they will be wonderful in a few years' time, but we have to work on that. Otherwise, it's hypocrisy to talk about shifting the trillions if you don't address that issue. That's the second conclusion. And the third one is, so we have to act on regulatory, fiscal, macroeconomic policy frameworks. Where do we stand? As Intermit said, only 4% of the climate finance goes into that. So this has to be changed. And Intermit and his team started to do that with our help, and that's very good. But we have to accelerate because we don't have the time. And therefore, we need more development policy operations to make that happen. And we need good ones. It's not only the quantity, it's also the quality. So my minister, in her written statement to the Development Committee, she asked for 10 at least climate development policy lending operations until the end of the year. I personally think that's fair. We have the G7 presidency, Germany, and we will bring that into the G7 presidency. And I hope that others will be on board. I've heard from Alexia that she is sympathizing, and we are along this, it seems that we are along similar lines. So I hope it's sufficiently convincing to make that point. And I also think that developing countries might join in because that's a compact. And we forged this compact with South Africa. And we have a development policy operation for South Africa. Money comes forward. We can mobilize more money. Even there would be a possibility that G7 countries, you know, they co-finance development policy lending operations of the World Bank and then have an even greater impact. I think that's something really with a high potential for all participants. And that's the one result coming out of today's discussion. Perhaps it's a little bit interpreted the way I would like to hear it, but I think it's fair nevertheless. And therefore, I would like to thank you, Annie, really great moderation. And I would also like to thank WRI co-hosting this event, my colleagues, all the participants, the panelists, really thanks a lot for participating. It was very rewarding for me. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Jürgen. Thank you very much. It was absolute pleasure for us, WRI, to co-host this with you again. This is a very, very important topic. And I at least from WRI, I'd really thank all of our participants here all the speakers, but all of you who have joined us. This is much innovation and much focus is needed exactly to get this right. And I look forward to working with and supporting all of you. And Alexia, I'm looking forward to seeing you in person sometime soon. But thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And Jürgen, thank you for doing this together.
Thanks to you, Ani.
Thank you, Jürgen. I wish I had said it like you said it. Very nice.
We'll say it together. In a week's time, we'll see there. See you then.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, Alexia.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Vielen Dank.
Daniel, wonderful meeting you. Thanks.
Thanks a lot.